Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Keegan Wardell. I made my living chasing rot, hanging doors, and rebuilding porches for the lake crowd, people who only showed up on weekends. The work was steady, the pay was uneven, and every job came with the same demand. Make it solid, make it simple, make it last. Home was a small ranch on the edge of town, 10 minutes from the public boat ramp. Out back, I kept a saw, a nail pouch, and a stack of scrap lumber that never quite turned into a project. Most nights used to end with a hot shower, a cheap dinner, and whatever the local station decided to call news. The floating dock started as a side hustle. After a bad storm, a homeowner upgraded to a new modular system, and the old sections were headed for a dumpster. I salvaged them, replaced the connectors, and rigged up a square platform about 13 feet by 13 feet. In the summer, it stayed tied off near a quiet cove, and I used it for fishing and a break from people. Then the sickness hit the radio. First it was a city far away, then it was a county over, then it was static and panic on the scanner at night. Stores put up cardboard signs. Folks stopped shaking hands. The boat ramp got busy in a way that didn't feel right. One cold afternoon, I stood on that dock with a tool bag at my feet and the lake flat as glass in front of me. The idea was simple. A dock is already a floor. Water is space. Space buys time. If the land turned into a fight, the safest room I could build might be the one that floats. So I started writing this down step by step, because details matter when everything else breaks. For whoever is left to listen. The first real change was the traffic near the ramp. It wasn't just more cars, it was the wrong kind of cars. Sedans packed to the roofliners with blankets, people staring straight ahead like they were already late to a funeral. A week earlier, the talk was just a flu and a few overwhelmed hospitals. Now the talk was about people turning violent and not acting right, and nobody wanted to say much out loud. At my house, the nights got colder fast. The furnace kicked on, but the wind found every thin spot around the window frames, and my attention kept drifting from the TV to the street. On job sites, half-built decks sat abandoned, ladders left leaning against gutters, plywood sheets lying in the grass like the crews had walked off mid-cut. A neighbor stood at his mailbox for 10 minutes just scrolling his phone, then turned around and went back inside without even taking the mail. Work calls dried up in 48 hours. The same clients who used to text me at dawn about a loose stair tread went dead silent. The hardware store stayed open, but the line at the counter wrapped past the paint mixer and down the lumber aisle. One guy tried to buy a pallet of propane bottles, and the clerk shut him down hard. A woman argued about AA batteries until her voice cracked, then she walked out with empty hands. That was when the lake started to look less like a weekend getaway, and more like the only space I could control. The dock was still where I left it, tied off near reeds in a cove on the north shore, close enough to reach without driving through the choke points downtown. It wasn't a boat and it wasn't fast, but it was mine, and I knew every bolt and connector on it. A short list went on a notepad and stayed on the kitchen table. Water, heat, food, light, rope, tools. The rest was clutter. Carpentry teaches you something simple. If you don't have a floor and a roof, you don't have a plan, and if you don't have fasteners and a way to cut, you don't have a build. The next morning, sirens screamed past my street and didn't come back for a long time. A message hit the local community chat from a woman I knew from a siding job last summer. She wrote, "Stay inside. Don't go to the clinic. They are locking it down." A man replied, "My cousin saw one of them bite a paramedic." Another person wrote, "Stop. You're making it worse." At noon, I drove to the grocery store and parked at the far edge of the lot, nose out for a quick exit. People moved fast, heads down, and the carts were overloaded with the panic staples: canned food, rice, peanut butter, water, and anything that didn't need a fridge. Inside, a calm voice on the store PA system told everyone to remain orderly. It didn't help. On the way home, I stopped for gas and 2 empty jerry cans. The clerk kept a baseball bat on the counter and watched the door like it was going to kick itself open. A man in a hoodie argued about the gallon limit sign, then shoved past me on the way out. Outside, a stray shopping cart lay tipped over and the wind pushed it across the asphalt until it hit a pump with a loud, hollow clang. Heads snapped toward the sound. Nobody laughed. No big speech happened in my head. The choice was plain. Staying home meant waiting for other people to show up with their problems, and problems are loud. The dock meant distance, and distance means fewer surprises. Back at the house, supplies went to the living room floor in neat piles: cans, rice, pasta, jerky, coffee, electrolyte packets, 4 or 5 gallon water jugs, heavy contractor bags, 2 tarps, duct tape, a hand crank lantern and spare batteries, a small first aid kit and extra bandages pulled from my truck. Tools mattered more than comfort, so the belt and bag got loaded like a heavy job day. Hammer, pry bar, utility knife, tape measure, pencil, handsaw, an impact driver with 2 batteries and a box of exterior screws, a small socket set and an adjustable wrench, a coil of nylon rope and a few ratchet straps, gloves, a box of nails because sometimes nails are faster than screws when your hands are numb. A duffel took wool layers, spare socks, a rain jacket, and my cold weather sleeping bag. A foam pad rolled up with it. From the kitchen, I took 2 pots, a spoon, and a lighter, then stopped and looked at the stove like it was a promise I couldn't carry. My sister called once. Her voice sounded tight, barely holding it together. "Are you hearing this?" she asked. "Yeah," I answered. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Out on the lake," I said. "That's crazy," she added. The call dropped, and it never came back. By late afternoon, the truck was packed. The sky stayed steel gray and the wind off the water smelled sharp. One last walk through of the house took less than a minute. Lights off, doors locked. It was habit, not hope. The dock was waiting, and the first trip to it had to be clean and quiet because once I started moving things, someone was going to notice. Bypassing the public ramp took some foresight. The ramp sat too close to town, and by then it felt like a magnet for every desperate soul in the county. A narrow service road ran behind a row of summer cabins on the North Shore, blocked by an old maintenance gate that would still open if you lifted the chain and slid it off the post. That was the route. The truck chewed through ruts with the headlights off until the last stretch, then the beams swept across empty decks and dark windows. No porch lights, no music, just wind and the crunch of tires on gravel. At the end of the road, a short footpath dropped to the water, and the dock sat where it always sat, a square of modular floats tucked into the reeds. A rope cleat on a buried post gave me a tie point. I threw a proper hitch, 1 wrap figure 8, lock it down, a knot that would hold even if I fell asleep. Supplies moved in steady loads because rushing makes noise and noise makes mistakes. Water jugs went first to anchor the weight, then food, then tools and bedding. The platform dipped a little under the load and settled back level. This cove was a staging area, not a sanctuary. It was a work zone close enough to shore that I could hike to nearby cabins and drag back what I needed. The plan was to build the shelter while the dock was easy to access, then move it out when the structural work was done. Before I started scavenging, a few habits got set in stone. A safety line stayed tied to the dock at all times with a backup knot. The tool bag stayed in one corner, organized. The lantern stayed taped over so it wouldn't flash bright by accident. Small rules like that keep you from wasting seconds when your hands are numb and your mind is racing. The first cabin I checked belonged to a guy who used to hire me for porch repairs. His truck wasn't in the driveway. The front door was locked, but the back slider had a busted latch, the same hardware failure I'd warned him about all summer. A palm on the frame told me it had play. I gave it a lateral shove and it slid open, and inside the air smelled stale. The place looked half-packed, like someone had started to leave and then just quit. I didn't call out. Listening mattered more than being polite. I used the impact driver to back the screws out of a stack of plywood leaning behind the couch. 2 sheets were clean enough to use. A bundle of 2x4 offcuts and cull lumber lay under a workbench. Those went on my shoulder. Back at the dock, the load slid onto the deck with a soft thump and got covered right away. The second cabin had what I really needed for winter: heat. A small cast-iron wood stove sat in a corner room, the kind meant for a hunting shack. The pipe ran up through the ceiling and out the roof. Extracting it was going to be loud and slow, but freezing later would be worse. The self-tapping screws in the stovepipe fought me. Fingers went numb, then came back sharp with pain as I worked the driver bit and the wrench. After a few minutes, the sections twisted apart. The stove itself was dead weight, but it had side handles and it would fit on the dock if I slid it instead of lifting it. A heavy moving blanket from the closet became a sled. The stove rode down the path in short drags, scraping leaves and dirt, and every metallic scrape made my jaw clench. Halfway back, a barking sound cut through the trees, fast, rough, aggressive, then stopped instantly like someone had yanked a cord. A normal dog doesn't stop that clean. I kept moving and didn't look for it. Power was next. Late fall days end early, and a candle in a small space can burn you alive. One cabin had a simple trickle-charge solar setup, 2 small panels and a battery box in a closet. The panels weren't fancy, but they were light. One came down, then the other carried flat against my chest so the wind wouldn't catch them like sails. The battery box was heavier than it looked, but it had a strap handle and fit into a milk crate. The wind generator came from the back lot of a small marina office. It wasn't a big tower, just a little turbine on a short mast, the kind you see on garden sheds. The gate lock was cheap brass. I set the pry bar in the shackle and torqued it until the hasp popped. The bolts were rusty, so the teardown was slow and quiet, quarter turns and pauses, listening between each move. A voice carried from the road above. "Hey!" a man called, sharp and suspicious. My shoulders tightened and I crouched behind a stack of dock floats. The footsteps stopped on the gravel. A second voice, a woman, said, "Leave it, Paul, it's not worth it." The man muttered something angry, then the steps faded. Back on the dock, the turbine and mast lay flat. Nothing went vertical yet. Everything stayed low, covered under tarps and ratchets strapped down. By sundown, the platform looked like a framing crew had exploded on it. But it was a start. Wood for walls, a stove for heat, panels and a battery for light, and enough rope to keep it all from sliding into the lake. The last thing that evening was a scan of the shoreline and the path back to the truck. No headlights, no voices. Still, the feeling didn't go away. Scavengers follow the easy paths, and once they noticed a dock that didn't belong to them, they would want it. Framing on water isn't like framing on a slab. The floor moves under you. Every tool wants to slide toward the edge, and a drop screw is an offering to the lake, gone for good. The dock was stable enough to stand on, but it still had a live feel, bouncing whenever I shifted my weight. The first step was killing that momentum. 2 ropes ran from opposite corners to hardwoods on the shore, ratcheted tight and tied low so the dock couldn't swing or drift. A third static line ran to a buried post just in case one knot slipped. With the platform pinned in place, the work could stay simple. The safehouse had to fit the deck constraints. 13 feet by 13 feet sounds like a room, but it's tight once you start factoring in door swing, stove clearance, and a place to sleep. I didn't just guess. I laid it out, marking the plates right on the deck panels, leaving a narrow catwalk along the east edge so I could still fish and step off without climbing over supplies. A basic skeleton went up first. The salvaged 2x4s were a mixed bag of lengths, so I sorted the cull pile, kept the longest pieces for plates, and used the offcuts for studs. A carpenter never starts with the pretty cut. You start with what you have and you force it to be square. The bottom plate got fastened to the dock deck in short sections with wide fender washers under each screw head so the metal wouldn't tear through the plastic surface. I kept the drill on low torque. High-speed whining screams across flat water like a siren. When a screw bit clean into the backing, the sound was a low compression thrum instead of a sharp squeal. Corners went up as 4 posts, each one braced back to the floor with temporary diagonals so the whole box wouldn't rack when the wind hit it. The lake breeze picked up around noon, pushing on the frame like a heavy hand, but the bracing held true. By mid-afternoon, the wall studs were filled in, 16 inches on center where I had the stock, wider where I ran out of straight lumber. The gaps didn't bother me. Plywood covers a lot of sins, and winter doesn't care if your stud spacing looks code compliant. The door needed to be a fortress, not an entryway. A pre-hung door would have been perfect, but I wasn't hauling a bulky frame through the woods. I built a site-made slab door from doubled plywood and Z-bracing, then hung it on heavy-duty strap hinges I'd pulled from a shed. The latch was a solid steel slide bolt, no fancy knob, nothing with springs to jam if it froze. Light mattered, but glass is a liability. It's loud when it breaks and it shines when you don't want it to. One small window opening went on the north wall, high enough that someone on shore would have to stand at the water's edge to look in. For the pane, I used a clear polycarbonate sheet from an old storm window, screwed down with wooden battens like a picture frame. A second, narrower slit went on the west side, a murder hole that let me watch the approach path without stepping outside. Before skinning the walls, I wrestled the stove into its corner. It was easier to place the heavy iron now than to try and wedge it in after the walls were closed. A square of cement board scavenged from a ruined bathroom remodel served as a thermal break, and a few fire bricks from the marina yard lifted the stove legs off the plastic floor. On plastic and plywood, you respect heat or you burn your boat. As I set the stove down, the entire dock dipped noticeably in that corner. The water line crept up the side of the floats. I knew right then I was pushing the weight limit. Eventually, I'd need to add extra flotation, empty barrels or foam under the frame, but for now it floated even if it rode heavy. Plywood sheathing went up in full sheets where I had them and pieced together scraps where I didn't. I broke the seams over studs when possible, then covered the exterior gaps with thin furring strips ripped from scrap. It wasn't pretty, but it cut the drafts, and drafts are what make you wake up shaking with hypothermia. Every panel got screws, not nails. Nails back out when a structure flexes, and a floating house never stops flexing. Screws hold. When one squeaked going in, I backed it out and ran the threads across a bar of soap, then drove it again. That one trick kept the work quiet and saved my wrists from fighting the friction. The roof had to be flat enough to mount solar panels, but it still needed pitch to shed rain and snow. I tested the angle with a bucket, poured water along the ridgeline, and watched it spill off the back without pooling. Two long rafters ran front to back, carried by shorter purlins. I cut the back wall studs a few inches taller than the front to create the shed roof slope. From the shoreline, the profile was low and boxy, hard to spot, but inside I could stand without hunching. For the roof skin, I used the cleanest plywood and covered it with a heavy tarp, then a second tarp, overlapped like giant shingles. The edges wrapped down and got trapped under battens, so the wind couldn't peel them up like a banana skin. Duct tape sealed the overlaps, and every tape line got burnished hard with the handle of a screwdriver to bond the adhesive in the cold. The chimney needed its own penetration. Cutting through a roof you just sealed feels wrong, but smoke has to go somewhere. I marked the spot above the stove, cut a tight square, and slid the pipe through. I fashioned a collar from thin sheet metal, screwed it down, and tarred every edge. It wasn't a factory flashing, but it was better than an open gap dripping rain onto hot iron. Inside, I started chinking the weak points. Rolled towels and spare rags got stuffed into the biggest corner gaps. Foam chunks from an old destroyed dock float were wedged under the wall plates where the deck panels didn't sit flush. Over the floor, I laid a strip of old carpet as a runner. It wasn't for comfort, it was so my boots wouldn't bang against the bare plastic deck. That first night inside the structure, I didn't sleep much. The new walls cut the wind, but they also trapped sounds, turning the cabin into a drum. Every small creak of the floats made me sit up. Around midnight, I heard voices far off down near the road, then a car door slam, then nothing. In the morning light, the cabin looked like a plain, ugly crate. But it was a crate with a lockable door, 2 windows, a stove, and a roof that could support power. I ran my hand along the door edge and checked the latch twice. The dock was still tied tight, still hidden in the reeds, but it was heavier now. The next job was making sure nobody decided it was worth taking. Pushing off was the next phase. Staying close to shore was convenient, but in this new world, convenience gets you killed. The cabin gave me shelter, but it also increased the dock's profile, turning a flat raft into a visible target. The mission shifted from make it solid to make it disappear. Camouflage started with distressing the materials. A clean, bright blue tarp reads like fresh supplies. A dirty, stained tarp reads like garbage. I took handfuls of shoreline muck and scrubbed it into the lower panels in the fabric, working the grit in until the sheen was gone. When I hung the plywood skin, the best grade sheets faced inward where I lived. The ugly, knot-filled, sun-bleached sides faced the trees. I taped a piece of cardboard over the small shoreside window, leaving just a narrow peel-back strip for observation. From 50 yards away, I wanted to look like a pile of drifting debris, not a home. To control the drift, I needed a stabilizer. A normal anchor is fine for deep water, but it allows swing. I needed something rigid for the shallows. A length of heavy galvanized pipe became a sleeve for a Spud pole. I bolted the sleeve to the outside corner of the dock frame using carriage bolts. The pole itself was a straight 12-foot section of thick wall aluminum tubing I'd salvaged, with a flat steel plate bolted to the bottom like a foot. In shallow water, I could drive it down to pin the dock in place against the mud. In deep water, it acted as a rudder or a brake. The move happened at first light. Wind is usually dead calm at dawn, and fewer eyes are scanning the water. The shorelines came off one by one, coiled silently and stowed. Everything on deck got strapped down tight. The stove door was latched. The battery crate got a secondary bungee. Loose boards got screwed fast. A floating house only survives if the load can't shift. Poling a heavy dock isn't like paddling a canoe. It doesn't glide, it wallows, it fights back. The trick is leverage, short planted pushes in steady direction, not hard shoves that throw you off balance and into the drink. The pole went down through the sleeve, bit into the bottom, and took my weight. A push moved the dock a few feet. The pole came up, slid forward, and went down again. Plant, push, reset. Once the reeds were behind me, the lake opened up. The protection of the cove vanished, and small waves started slapping the plastic floats, creating a hollow, rhythmic drumming under the floor. The cabin creaked as the platform flexed over the chop. That noise was mechanically normal, but it still made my shoulders knot up. A storm out here could build rollers big enough to wash over the deck, so my anchoring plan had to be redundant. I built a quiet anchor from scrap. A brake rotor from a junked heavy-duty truck served as the weight, cast iron, heavy and compact. I shackled it to a short length of chain to take the abrasion, then spliced that to 200 feet of nylon rope. The chain was short enough that it wouldn't drag and rattle against the rotor. When the depth sounded right, I lowered the rotor over the side, hand over hand, no splash, no free fall. I let the rope pay out in smooth coils, giving it enough scope to hold. The dock drifted back. The line drew tight and the heavy swing stopped. I dropped the spud pole next, not to anchor, but to act as a second friction point so the dock wouldn't rotate and flash its door toward the land. Before dark, I rigged one more insurance line. A second rope ran from the opposite corner to a small marker float made from a sealed cooler which was tied to a secondary rotor weight. It wasn't for fair weather. It was for 2 a.m., when the wind shifts 180 degrees and the dock swings violently. 2 anchors meant triangulation and fewer rude awakenings. The perimeter defense came last. I didn't know for a fact if the sick could swim yet, and I wasn't planning to be the guy who found out the hard way. Even if they couldn't, people in boats certainly could. The best defense against boarding is distance and entanglement. A sprinter can't leap what it can't reach. I rigged a standoff line around the dock, floating about 8 feet out. It was a loop of rope supported by empty plastic jugs. I partially filled each jug with water so they sat low and heavy in the chop, resisting the wind. The line stayed loose enough to rise with the swell, but tight enough to foul a propeller or tangle a swimmer's arm. No spikes, no elaborate traps. The goal wasn't to kill. The goal was to slow, to buy seconds, and to create a buffer zone. To keep the system quiet, I added bumpers. I cut up old foam pool noodles scavenged from a cabin closet and threaded them onto a line run under the deck edge. It looked stupid, bright neon foam against the dirty wood, but it kept the hard plastic jugs from banging against the floats in a gust. By midday, the dock sat in open water, far enough from the nearest bank that a person would need a boat or a serious swim to reach it. From the shore, it looked like a tired, abandoned fishing platform with a utility box on it. Up close, it was a fortress with a stove, a door, and a plan. The last part of the setup was the routine. A quick check in the morning, knots, rope chafe, battery strap, stove clearance, and the sky. A second check at dusk. Same list, plus a scan of the shoreline with naked eyes. No optics that could glint, no bright lights, no waving. Anything that made me work harder than necessary got fixed immediately. Because winter work is brutal, and brutal work makes noise. That night, with the dock finally sitting where I wanted it, the lake felt massive and the town felt miles away. The safety wasn't absolute, but it was real enough to build on. The next test wouldn't come from the water, it would come from the shore. Water came from the lake, which meant it was everywhere, but it was also a giant petri dish. It looked clear on calm days, but the shoreline was a soup of runoff, dead leaves, and whatever biological mess the outbreak had dumped into the tributaries upstream. The rule became absolute. If it goes in your mouth, you treat it. A 5-gallon day jug sat inside by the door, and the bulk storage stayed sealed as backup. For raw lake water, a separate container got wrapped in red duct tape so it never got mixed up by accident. That visual cue saved me from making a sloppy, fatal mistake when I was dead tired. The filtration setup was gravity-fed and basic. A wide-mouth bucket held a cloth pre-filter to catch the big stuff, sand, algae, bugs, draining into a store-bought cartridge filter I'd scavenged from a cabin pantry. It wasn't a magic bullet and it wasn't fast, but it knocked down the turbidity and cleared the visible junk. After that, the water still got heated. Boiling is the gold standard, but a rolling boil burns through wood fast and fuel was labor. I used a thermometer and did it the smart way. Pasteurization. Water only needs to hit 160 degrees Fahrenheit to kill the biologicals. A pot went on the stove, the thermometer clipped to the rim, and I watched that needle like it was a religious icon. Once it hit the mark, the clean water cooled in covered jugs so ash and dust couldn't settle back in. Each cap got a piece of tape with the date written on it. Not because I loved paperwork, but because stagnant water goes flat and tastes like plastic, and bad taste makes you want to cut corners. Power was the next hurdle. Nights were long in late autumn, and a cabin without light turns into a pitch-black trip hazard. A flashlight helps, but you burn through AA batteries fast, and batteries were already becoming the new currency on shore. The plan was to generate my own microgrid and keep it boring. The 2 solar panels went on the roof first. They were small 100-watt units, low profile, so they didn't catch much wind. I bolted them down with lag screws and used neoprene washers to seal the penetrations. The cables ran through a tight hole I drilled near the back eave, which I packed with butyl tape and covered with a smear of roofing tar. Inside the battery bank, just a heavy deep-cycle marine unit, stayed in a milk crate strapped to the floor so it wouldn't slide if the dock rocked. A simple charge controller sat on the wall above it, the cheap kind with dummy lights to tell you if you were charging or draining. No digital screens, no Bluetooth. The goal was to keep the battery healthy and avoid the kind of mistakes that melt insulation. The wind generator came next because the lake churns even when the sun gives up early. I mounted the mast on the roof but closer to the center line so the leverage wouldn't torque the cabin frame in a gust. The critical part was noise control. A turbine vibrates, and on a plywood box that vibration hums like a cello. I mounted the base on thick rubber pads cut from an old tire to dampen the sound. 2 diagonal braces ran down to the wall frame with turnbuckles I could hand tighten. When the turbine spun, it made a soft rhythmic whir, not a mechanical scream, and that mattered for stealth. Wiring stayed short and armored. Cables ran along the ceiling line and dropped down the corner in a piece of plastic conduit scavenged from the marina office. Every connection was crimped, taped, and zip-tied. A small fuse block went in between the battery and the load, because one short to ground can burn a wooden cabin down faster than any zombie can chew through a door. The first real test came after sunset. A single LED strip light went up over the stove area, and a small reading lamp hung near the door. Both stayed on their lowest dimmer setting. Light discipline was strict. Too much glow turns your frosted windows into a beacon for anyone on shore. With the lamps on, the cabin felt livable. You could see your hands, find your boots, and read a label without fumbling for a lantern. The radio sat on a shelf by the window, volume set to a murmur. Some nights it was just static. Other nights you'd catch a county emergency loop giving the same outdated warning over and over, telling people to shelter in place and avoid the public ramp area. That last part kept manifesting in different ways. A few times I heard shouting carried across the water, desperate, angry voices, followed by 1 or 2 gunshots, then the heavy quiet returned. Charging became a rhythm. During daylight, the panels did the heavy lifting. At night, the wind turbine trickled power in when the weather turned foul. On calm, overcast days, I rationed the amps. On windy nights, the battery topped off while I slept. It felt like cheating in the best possible way. Water and power changed the psychology of the place more than the walls did. Warm water meant clean hands and less dysentery. Light meant fewer accidents and less fear. A charged radio meant you could hear the world ending before it landed on your doorstep. Once those systems were online, the dock stopped feeling like a desperate raft and started feeling like a station, a place I could actually hold until the ice forced a move. Cold affects everything, especially lead-acid chemistry. So the battery crate stayed off the floor on a small wood riser, close enough to the stove to stay above freezing, but far enough that the heat wouldn't cook the cells. Once a week I ran a diagnostic, checked the voltage, checked the connections, wiped the dust. Next on the list was the calorie deficit. Food is the part people romanticize in movies, like you just cast a line into the sunset and a grilled dinner shows up on a plate. The reality on a cold lake is work, and it's a grind you have to manage without burning through every calorie dense you humped out there. The first rule was asset protection. Canned goods stayed in 2 heavy-duty plastic totes with latching lids, one for daily meals, one for deep reserves. Both totes sat on a raised platform to keep them off the freezing floor and away from any bilge water that might seep in during a storm. Rice and pasta went into heavy mylar bags inside a third tote. Mice can't swim to me, but they can stow away on a materials run, and I wasn't betting my survival on luck. A small shelf over the stove became the ready station. Coffee, salt, a few spice packets, matches, and the pot all lived there. I didn't want to be digging through buried crates with frozen hands. Every time you shuffle gear in a tight space, you drop something, and dropped gear makes noise that carries across the water. Fishing started simple. A rod and reel works fine, but it requires active attention, and time is a resource I couldn't waste when the wind was cutting and I still had chores to finish before dark. So I rigged a trot line, a long, submerged line anchored at both ends with baited circle hooks spaced out on short drop lines. I could check it twice a day without leaning dangerously over the edge. Bait came from what I could spare, small pieces of tough beef jerky or a few bits of canned meat. The dock wasn't a boat, so I couldn't chase the schools. Instead, I warped the whole platform a few yards at dawn and again before dusk, using the Spud pole and a short haul line just to change the depth and avoid fishing a stale spot. The wind pushed the dock into new water anyway, and those small adjustments kept the line from snagging on the same bottom debris all week. The first decent catch was a smallmouth bass. Gutting it on the deck felt like a luxury. The second catch was 2 bluegills back to back, and that was proof of concept. The lake could sustain me. I didn't celebrate. I cleaned them fast, rinsed the mess with lake water, and got the scraps into a sealed bag immediately. But you don't just toss guts overboard. Guts float, and floating guts attract gulls. Birds circling a specific spot tell everyone on shore that food is here. I learned to puncture the swim bladders so the waste would sink straight to the bottom, feeding the crayfish instead of the birds. Smell is a liability on the water. You can't leave a can of Spam open in a corner. Anything strong carries on the breeze, and even if the sick don't track scent like bloodhounds, wild dogs do, and animals get bold when the alpha predator disappears. So the food routine included strict trash control. Every scrap went into double-sealed bags. Those bags went into a 5-gallon bucket with a gasket lid that stayed outside on the walkway, clipped to a cleat. Once every couple of days, when the wind was blowing hard away from shore, I'd take the bucket to the far side of the dock, weigh the bag down with a rock, and sink it deep. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the cabin from smelling like a bait shop. Cooking stayed primitive. One-pot meals, nothing fancy because doing dishes burns filtered water and fuel. Rice with beans, chili stretched with rice. Oatmeal when the morning was brutal. Fish got pan-fried on the stove with a little oil, and whatever was left got wrapped tight and eaten cold the same day. No raw risk, no leftovers sitting out. Storage became a game of moisture control. A wet glove can ruin a day. A damp sleeping bag can kill you. I rigged a drying rack above the stove, just a piece of heavy wire and 2 hooks, where wet socks hung until they were stiff and warm. Boots stayed strictly near the door, so the meltwater stayed in one spot. That corner by the door became the hygiene block. Hygiene isn't optional when you're trapped in a 160-square-foot box breathing the same air all night. A plastic jug with a spigot sat on a crate for hand washing. Soap was tied to the handle with paracord so it couldn't slide behind a tote. A small bottle of bleach lived in a labeled bag, and a single drop went into the wash water when I handled fish or waste. Not enough to burn skin, just enough to keep a minor cut from turning into sepsis. For the toilet setup, a 5-gallon honey bucket with a snap-on seat lid sat behind a hanging tarp panel near the back wall. It was for bad weather and emergencies only. Most times, the lake handled it with a simple rule. Go off the downwind corner, keep a hand on the rail, and use a rinse dipper so nothing fouled the floats. The bucket got lined with heavy bags and a scoop of sawdust or dry leaves after every use, then sealed tight and stored outside until I could dump it safely away from camp. Cleaning tools mattered too. A spray bottle held diluted bleach water for wiping the counter, the door latch, and the floor. A brush and dustpan lived by the threshold because grit on the floor turns into crunching noise, and crunching noise travels. Once the systems were running, the days started to bleed together in a good way. The routine was the clock. Morning, check the anchor lines, check the battery voltage, stoke the stove, make coffee, run the trot line. Midday, patch the roof tape, tighten bolts, inventory food, filter water. Late afternoon, cook, clean, reset the line, black out the windows, and sit with the radio volume low. Some evenings, the shoreline was dead empty. Other evenings, movement showed up where it shouldn't. A silhouette on a distant private dock, a flashlight beam sweeping a cabin window that should have been dark. Once a dog barked from the tree line, and the bark sounded wrong, jagged, repetitive, angry at the world rather than just guarding a yard. The dock kept me fed, warm, and busy, but it also fixed me in one geographic point. Being fixed makes you a landmark if someone decides to look. The next problem wasn't going to be hunger. It was going to be the thing that notices smoke or light or movement and comes out to the edge to investigate. Real trouble came from the shore, driven by a Canadian cold front that sat on the lake for 48 hours and made the stove eat hardwood like it was kindling. The next fuel loads had to come from land, because driftwood was scarce in deep water and I wasn't about to burn my framing lumber just to stay warm. The dock got pulled toward a stretch of shoreline, choked with cattails and a steep clay bank, a place with no cabins and no easy path down from the road. I kept the standoff line deployed until the last second. The spud pole went down, bit into the soft bottom, and held the platform hovering just off the mud while I scanned the brush. The dead showed up first. 2 shapes stumbled out of the scrub oak about 20 yards down the bank. Heads low, arms loose, clothes hanging off them wrong. They didn't see me yet. They just drifted toward the game trail I'd used earlier in the week. From inside the cabin, I cracked the side window an inch, watching through the cardboard gap, hands tight on the pole, ready to break the hold and slide back if one of them turned. Then the barking started. It wasn't one dog. It was two, then three, and the sound wasn't normal territorial guarding. It was fast, high-pitched, and angry, coming in jagged bursts like the animals were circling a kill. The noise pulled the shamblers away from my path, which should have been a break, but then paws hit the shallow water. Two dogs broke out of the cattails on the near bank, ribs showing through patchy coats, eyes locked on the dock like it was a slab of meat. They didn't bark. They just charged. They hit the lake running, splashing through the knee-deep muck, closing the distance fast. I shoved the pole down hard, leaning my entire weight into it to back the dock away, because if they reached the floats while they still had footing, they could leap. The first dog hit the drop-off where the shelf ended. It didn't swim, it went vertical, thrashing and snapping at the water, fighting to keep its snout up. The second one tried to lunge, hit the standoff line, and got fouled in the jugs. It rolled over, coughing water, legs kicking uselessly against the deep. A gun would have ended it, but the shot would have echoed for miles. The dock slid back into safer depth, and the dogs were left treading water, furious but unable to close the gap. While they fought the current and the rope, a human shout cut through the wind. "Hey, don't leave!" a man yelled, and his voice cracked on the last word like he hadn't used it in days. The view through the trees opened enough to see him on the flat roof of a small, dilapidated boathouse. He was waving one arm, a backpack strapped to his chest like a life vest. Below him on the walkway, 4 shamblers scraped uselessly at the siding, and the dogs in the water turned toward his voice. 8 feet of deep water and my standoff line sat between us. He couldn't swim through that mess of rope and jugs without getting tangled, and I couldn't bring the dock in tight without giving the thrashing dogs a solid platform to scramble onto. I slid the window open a few more inches and kept my voice flat and projected. "Get low and stop yelling," I said, pointing to the water. "Can you get to the edge without jumping?" He crouched immediately and said, "There's a ladder inside, but the door is jammed with bodies and I can't open it from up here." He swallowed hard, looking at the water, and added, "Those dogs were normal yesterday, now they don't stop hunting, and I had to thread the needle." The dock moved in short, controlled feet. The pole came up, shifted, and went down again, walking the platform toward the boathouse wall while keeping clear of the shallows. I used the end of the pole to hook the standoff line and pull it taut, pinning the jugs against the boathouse pilings so they wouldn't drift. The man watched my hands, reading the mechanics. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. His voice was a whisper now, which told me he could learn. I kept my eyes on the dogs, which were paddling back toward the mud bank, defeated by the depth. "Drop your bag first," I said. "Then sit on the edge. When I tell you, you move fast and you don't argue." He nodded once, unclipped the pack, and let it slide down the roofline. It thumped onto my deck. The shamblers on the shore turned toward the sound. I grabbed a long 2x4 with a heavy screw driven into the end, my boat hook, and opened the cabin door. The dock crept within 3 feet of the roof overhang. "Now," I said. He didn't hesitate. He dropped, hit the deck hard, rolled, and stayed down with his hands open and empty. "Thank you," he breathed, then clamped his mouth shut, remembering that sound is dangerous. The bag went inside first, then I grabbed the pole. The dock backed away, the standoff line sprang free, and we drifted out. The dogs lunged again from the shallows, snapping at the jugs, but the gap opened too fast and the platform slid out of their range. Only when open water was under us, 50 yards of safety, did I look at him properly. Mid-30s, hands scarred and greased, cheeks hollow, his jacket smelling like old refrigerant and nervous sweat. "Name," I said. He sat up slowly and answered, "Call him Herrera," and added, "I fixed commercial refrigeration units, walk-ins, grocery cases. I got stuck when the roads locked up." He lifted both sleeves without me asking and said, "No bites, no blood, just scratches from the shingles on that roof." A quick visual check confirmed it. Rules still mattered. "You sleep by the door tonight," I said, pointing to the corner furthest from the knives. "You touch my gear without asking, you go back to shore." He nodded and said, "Fair." Then his eyes tracked to the door seal and the roof seam where the tarp was taped. If you want it, I can help you keep the cold out of this box. I know drafts and I know gaskets. Colum kept his hands visible while I reset the pole and checked the anchor line. He followed directions without pushing back or asking dumb questions, which mattered more than any speech. I pulled the dock farther out than usual before firing up the stove because I didn't want the shore noise to pull any more trouble our way. Once the cabin warmed up, he rubbed his hands over the cast iron and said, "I hid in that boathouse since yesterday afternoon. I heard people down by the public ramp last night." He paused, looking at the fire, then added, "They weren't calling for help. They were arguing about who gets to launch, and somebody kept saying, 'Pay up or walk.'" That was the intel I needed. "We stay away from it," I said. He nodded and answered, "Good plan." They sounded organized, and they had rifles. Distance had bought me time earlier. Now it had to buy us time, at least for tonight. The first night with Colum on board, the cabin felt less like a survival coffin and more like a workspace. Having two people meant one could move without banging knees and elbows, and the stove stayed fed while I kept a constant watch on the shoreline through the slit behind the cardboard. He kept his voice low when he needed to speak, a natural whisper, not forced, and I did the same. Not just as a rule, but because sound still carried clean across the cold, density-layered air above the water. Morning brought a shifting wind, and with the wind came the drafts. Colum ran his grease-stained fingers along the door edge, pressed where the plywood met the frame, and said, "That gap is leaking heat like a sieve. If we leave it, the stove will eat twice the wood for half the warmth." I didn't argue. A rolled strip of denim got jammed into the seam. Then a rubber flap cut from an old floor mat got screwed over it with fender washers. The whistling stopped immediately. By midday, the chop got worse. The wind pushed us dangerously close to a submerged sandbar on the east side of the cove, and the dock slapped against its own floats in a way that made the cabin creak. We went through the boring, necessary checks again. Rope chafe, knot integrity, the Spud pole sleeve bolts, and the stovepipe collar. Small mechanical failures stack up fast in cold weather and turn fatal. The standoff jugs kept tapping in the waves, a rhythmic plastic drumbeat that was annoying but better than having hands on the deck. Late afternoon gave us the first clear sign the fast ones were hunting the perimeter. A duck hit the water near the reeds and flapped hard to take off. Something pale surged up from the mud, not swimming but exploding out of the shallows. It grabbed the bird mid-flap, dragged it under, and then scrambled up a wet log on all fours with a speed that didn't look human. Colum watched it through the mesh and said, "That's not a shambler. That thing moves like a cat." I eased the Spud pole down, feeling for the bottom, and answered, "It's tracking the splash. We're drifting too close to the shelf." Not long after that, noise carried from the east shore. Metal clanging against metal, voices raised in panic, and then a short, controlled burst of gunfire that ended as quickly as it started. The sound was a dinner bell. 3 sprinters broke out of the reeds on the far bank, running low to the ground with their heads snapping side to side. They didn't slow down at the water's edge. They hit the shallows at a dead sprint, kicking up spray, aiming straight for us. The cabin door swung shut and the latch clicked home. I stayed low by the side slit with one hand on the pole sleeve and the other gripping the interior rope ladder. The dock was hovering over waist-deep water, the danger zone. Colum crawled to the stove side, keeping his center of gravity low, and asked, "Do you want me on the line or on the door?" I kept my eyes on the white water churning toward us and said, "Line first. If they get tangled, we drag them. If they climb, we bleed." The first sprinter reached the standoff line where the water was chest deep. It didn't swim. It launched itself off the bottom. The rope dipped under its weight. The weighted jug popped up under its chin and it rolled sideways, thrashing and snapping at the plastic. It had no buoyancy, just rage. The second one tried to dive under the line but got confused by the depth drop-off. It came up tangled, slamming its forearms onto the jugs and dragging the line down. The standoff system started creeping toward us in the chop. Colum pulled the spare rope from the corner crate, fed it through a cleat and said, "I'm putting tension on the secondary line. If I lift it, they can't ride it in." He worked in short, efficient movements, tying a trucker's hitch that wouldn't slip when wet. The standoff line snapped taut, holding the thrashing bodies 5 feet out. The third sprinter didn't waste time on the center line. It ran wide, found the corner where the sandbar extended furthest, and lunged. Its hands landed on the edge of the dock float, fingers scrabbling for a grip on the wet plastic. It pulled its torso up, teeth bared, eyes blown wide and empty. I didn't shoot. I drove the spud pole down through the sleeve until it hit the hard sand bottom, and I threw my entire weight against it. The dock jerked and slid sideways away from the bar. The sprinter lost its purchase on the mud, slipped and hit the deep water. It thrashed once, tried to claw the air, and then sank like a stone. Gunfire cracked again from shore, louder and closer, and the 2 tangled sprinters paused, heads turning. The new noise was louder than us. One untangled itself and scrambled back toward the mud. The other followed, vanishing into the reeds. Colum stayed crouched, breathing hard, watching the empty water where the third one had gone down. "They don't swim," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "They sink, but they're fast enough to jump before they drown." I kept the pole braced, holding us over the black safe depth, and answered, "Nothing is a guarantee. We got lazy with the drift. We keep the gap clean from now on." After dark, we went into full lockdown. The radio stayed off, lights stayed dead, and no one used loud tools. The lake acts as a sounding board, carrying every bright thing and every sharp noise. Colum took the first watch by the slit. When the standoff jugs tapped in a steady rhythm, he whispered, "If that line starts walking in, wake me. We reset it before anything touches the hull." A few times we heard splashing out there, panic in the water, but it faded without hitting our ropes. Before sunrise, we checked the perimeter by hand, pulling in 1 jug at a time to check for damage, then tying it back so the line sat even. With daylight, the upgrade started immediately. We pushed the standoff line farther out, 10 feet instead of 8, and added more jugs so the rope couldn't sag under weight. Each jug got a drop line with a heavy bolt tied to it, keeping the barrier vertical in the water. While he tied knots, Colum said, "If the floats sit lower and deeper, it's harder for them to bridge the gap. Physics is on our side if we use it." We also hardened the access points. The rope ladder stayed inside only, coiled high and clipped. The door got a second drop bar made of 2x4 that could be flipped into place in one motion. Sound control became the priority. Loose metal handles on the crates got wrapped with cloth tape. The stovepipe got wedged with high-temp gasket material so it couldn't rattle in the wind. Any drilling or hammering happened strictly at midday when the wind was howling enough to cover the impact. Colum tightened a bolt on the wind turbine with a rag wrapped around the wrench head, looked at the cabin wall and said, "This is boring, tedious work." I nodded and answered, "Boring work keeps us alive. Excitement gets you eaten." The fast ones were out there now, patrolling the shallows, and the dock wasn't just a hiding spot anymore. It was a siege engine, and holding it meant we had to be smarter than the things hunting on the shore. 2 days after the sprinter tested our perimeter, the weather turned sharper and the shoreline grew louder at night, filled with distant shouting and the occasional flat crack of a hunting rifle that made the waterfowl lift off in nervous clouds. Colum and I kept the dock anchored in open water and kept working because the hard freeze was closing in, and we needed more calories before shore runs became suicide missions. A small state park campground sat on the west side, closed for the season with a brick bathhouse, a maintenance shed, and rows of empty picnic shelters. It was the kind of municipal setup that might have rope, heavy-duty plastic, and maybe a stray propane bottle left behind. We went in at midday when the wind was howling enough to mask sound, pulled the standoff line in on the shore side so it wouldn't snag, and pulled in until the floats grounded out gently in the mud. The place looked dead, but empty places still have movement. 2 slow walkers drifted between the shelters, and another swayed near the bathhouse entrance. No sprinters showed at first, which didn't relax me. It just made me wonder where they were crouching. Colum stayed on the dock, feet planted, pole in one hand and a stern line in the other. I stepped onto the bank with my flat bar and a small assault pack. The maintenance shed door was locked, but the padlock was a cheap master lock. A twist of the bar and a sharp jerk popped the hasp. Inside was useful junk, a roll of 6mm vapor barrier, a box of contractor trash bags, and a coil of braided polypropylene rope, plus a small tool pouch with lineman's pliers. A sound came from the bathhouse, a scrape and a dull thump, then absolute quiet. I froze and looked at Colum. He kept his eyes scanning the tree line and said, "You heard that?" I nodded and eased toward the brick wall. A woman's voice came through the heavy steel side door, low and strained. "If that's a person, say something," she said. I leaned close to the frame, keeping to the hinge side. "It's a person," I answered, "and I'm not opening anything until I know the situation." She took a jagged breath and said, "We're in the supply closet. The main entrance is blocked by bodies. There are dead outside." The bathhouse had a main entrance and this side utility door, which was half hidden by a brick trash enclosure. The front was compromised. The side door was the better angle, but it meant working in a fatal funnel. Colum lifted the pole a few inches and said, "If you want me on land, say it now." I shook my head and said, "Oh, stay put. Keep the engine running, so to speak." I tried the side door handle. It turned, but the heavy steel frame had shifted or rusted shut, and the latch wouldn't clear the strike plate. It needed force. I tapped the metal once. "Step back," I said. "Tell me your names." The first woman answered, "Mireya Klein," and added, "My friend is Tamsin Rowe. We're not sick." Tamsin spoke next, her voice higher but steady. "We have no bites and we can show you, but we need out before that thing comes back." "What thing?" I asked. Mireya answered, "The fast one. It crawls and it checks doors." Colum muttered a curse under his breath on the dock. We couldn't stand around picking a lock with a sprinter in the area. I needed mechanical advantage. I pulled a heavy-duty ratchet strap from my pack, one of the ones I'd grabbed on day one. I hooked one J-hook to the stuck door handle and the other to the steel post of the trash enclosure. I cranked the ratchet. The strap sang tight, putting hundreds of pounds of tension on the door. "When it pops, you move," I said. I jammed the flat bar into the door gap and hauled back. With a screech of tearing metal, the latch gave way and the strap yanked the door open a foot. Mireya's face appeared, pale and streaked with grime, eyes locked on my hands. "Keep it narrow," I said. "Single file." Mireya slid out first, then Tamsin. Both kept their hands visible. Each had a small day pack. As they stepped onto the muddy bank, a wet guttural snarl cut from the brush line, and a sprinter burst out on all fours, heading straight for the bathhouse like a heat-seeking missile. "Go!" I yelled. They scrambled onto the dock. Colum drove the Spud pole down and shoved hard, and the dock slid off the mud just as the sprinter hit the shoreline. I jumped the gap, landing on the deck as the creature launched itself into the shallows. It didn't swim, it thrashed through the knee-deep water, fueled by pure aggression, closing the distance fast. It lunged for the nearest float, but the water dropped off into the channel. It lost its footing, went under, and came up sputtering and flailing. The standoff line was already deploying, the jugs bobbing between us. The sprinter clawed at the plastic jugs, got tangled, and slipped beneath the surface as we drifted into the deep. We didn't watch it drown. The wind caught the cabin walls and pushed us out. In less than a minute, the campground was a gray strip behind us, and the only sound was our own heavy breathing. Inside the cabin, the door was double-barred, and the air warmed up fast. The dock felt heavier now. With 4 adults, the freeboard was almost gone, and the water lapped dangerously close to the deck edge. Rules came next. Mireya stood by the stove, shaking from the adrenaline dump. I stayed by the door and said, "Jackets off, sleeves up, do it slow." She complied without arguing, showing clean olive skin and old bruises. Tamsin did the same. Then her eyes darted to the roof seam where the tarp met the wall. "Your tape line is lifting on that corner," she said. "You're losing heat." Colum looked up from the stove and said, "She's right, I missed that." Names and skills came after the medical check. Mireya sat on a milk crate and said, I worked for the municipal water district. I'm not a doctor, but I know chemistry and I can keep us from drinking the wrong stuff. Tamsin wiped her hands on her jeans and said, I was a scenic carpenter for a theater company. I built sets. That means I can patch, sew, and make this place harder to spot at night. You're leaking light around the window frames. That evening, we adjusted the routine without making it a ceremony. Colum took the stove maintenance and structural checks. Mireya took water filtration and sanitation. Tamsin took storage efficiency and light discipline. She noticed leaks the way some people notice bad grammar. The watch schedule ran in 2-hour blocks after dark. 1 person up, 3 down. The radio stayed off unless there was a specific reason to listen. The cabin got tighter with 4 people. It was intimate and cramped, but it also got steadier. Someone could sleep deeply knowing someone else was listening. Chores got done before they turned into crises, but the extra bodies meant we were burning through calories and fuel twice as fast. We still needed heavy hardware, propane, and real medicine, and the only place left with access was the public ramp where the local warlords were charging tolls. Colum's knuckle looked innocent at first, a jagged tear from a roof shingle, but after 48 hours of damp cold, it turned angry. It stayed red, puffy, and hot to the touch. Mireya unwrapped the dressing, checked the lymph nodes in his armpit, and delivered the verdict with a flat voice. There's a red streak tracking up his wrist, she said. That's blood poisoning waiting to happen. If we don't hit it with broad-spectrum antibiotics, he loses the arm or we lose him. That was the forcing function. The cabin could handle blizzards and hungry dead, but it couldn't handle sepsis. We debated the route over the map. The main pharmacy was downtown, but the downtown grid was a death zone. The last radio report said the horde density there was impassable, a wall of meat blocking every street. That left the satellite clinic near the Marina district. The problem was the geography. The only road into that sector ran right past the public ramp, and we knew the toll booth crew was holding that choke point. We didn't want to go near them, but the landscape didn't give us a vote. It was the ramp or a funeral. The wind was chopping from the north, providing cover noise. We pulled the dock into the cattails about 200 yards east of the ramp, close enough to sprint, far enough to hide our profile. Tamsin manned the observation slit. I see a checkpoint, she whispered. Folding table, barrier tape, 2 guys with ARS on slings. Mireya peered over her shoulder. They're taking payment. Everyone who passes the chain drops a bag. A heavy log chain blocked the service road. 2 men stood behind the folding table, looking bored but dangerous. A plywood sign read ramp use fee. And below it, someone had spray-painted cash or trade. No one went in blind. Mireya stayed on the dock with the trauma kit as our rear guard. Tamsin manned the spud pole and the stern line, ready to launch. Colum and I went over the rail, keeping low in a muddy drainage ditch that ran parallel to the parking lot. We moved only when the guards were distracted. A woman at the chain was screaming, "I'm not paying you to leave my own town." And one of the gunmen laughed and answered, "Then you ain't leaving. Roads closed to freeloaders, sweetheart." The other guard waved a hand, telling the line of cars to back up. The clinic was 2 blocks up. We timed our crossing with a noisy diesel truck rolling through the checkpoint. The clinic's front glass was spider-webbed but intact. The door had been pried open. Inside, it was picked over, shelves stripped bare by panic shoppers. But looters are lazy. They grab what's at eye level and run. I vaulted the counter. In the bottom drawer of the pharmacist's station, way in the back, I found a sealed bottle of amoxicillin and a box of sterile wipes. Jackpot. We didn't get greedy. We grabbed the specific target and bailed. The return trip went sideways. We were 30 yards from the safety of the ditch when a voice snapped from between 2 parked SUVs. "You didn't pay the toll." A man stepped out, not one of the riflemen, but a scout. His hands were empty, but his eyes were locked on our packs. "You used the ramp zone," he said, grinning. Colum didn't flinch. He raised his good hand, palm out. "We aren't launching anything," he said. "We're walking." The scout stepped closer, blocking the path. "This is our asphalt. Drop the bags. and we'll decide if you get to keep your shoes." Colum feigned compliance, stepping forward like he was slipping a strap. "All right, let's trade," he said. Then he drove his shoulder into the guy's chest, launching him backward into the side of a sedan with a hollow thump. We sprinted. Behind us, a gunshot cracked, a warning shot into the air. But the noise did the work for us. It drew the attention of every walker in the tree line. As the guards yelled for order, chaos took over. We hit the mud running. The ditch took us back to the cattails, and the dock was already easing away. Tamsin had the pole in her hands, muscles tense. As our boots hit the edge, she hissed, "Get on now!" and shoved us away from the bank before we even regained our balance. We drifted into the open water before anyone on shore had a clean line of sight. Inside the cabin, the adrenaline dump left us shaking. Mireya took the bottle, checked the expiration, and said, "This buys us time. Maybe all winter." Colum flexed his throbbing hand and looked back at the shore. "They saw our exit vector," he said grimly. "They know we're water-based now." I nodded. "Then we disappear." That evening, Mireya gave him the first dose with food and water. "We treat this like it's the last medicine on Earth," she said. Tamsin was already taping extra cardboard over the shore-facing slit. "They'll watch the water now," she said. "So we stopped giving them patterns. No lights, no smoke during the day." Colum listened, then nodded toward the dark shoreline. "They'll wait for us, or they'll string a net across that cove." The answer was simple. The dock got pushed farther out into the black. The standoff line got reset, and the next landing would be somewhere ugly, remote, and inconvenient. We stayed off the radio and away from the shore the next day, letting the wind erase our tracks. The lake wasn't just a refuge anymore, it was a chessboard. The deep freeze settled in and refused to break. The dock groaned more at night as the ice thickened, and the stove demanded more BTUs to keep up, but the cabin held its heat. The battery bank stayed green and the water jug stayed potable because Mireya ran a tight ship. She didn't let anyone wing it, just because they were exhausted. Colum's hand healed up once the amoxicillin took hold, and he went back to doing what he does best, chasing drafts, dressing wire runs, and catching catastrophic failures while they were still minor annoyances. Tamsin turned the place into a black hole at night. She taped light leaks, hung blackout felt inside the window frames, and reorganized the stowage so the floor stayed clear for silent movement. The lake didn't solve everything, it just changed the geometry of the problem. Sprinters still patrolled the mudflats when shore noise drew them out, and the feral pack still prowled the reeds when we gutted fish, so we kept the standoff line deployed and the trash double-sealed. When the wind was blowing toward shore, we ate cold rations and saved the smoke signature for a safer day. The ramp crew became a permanent red zone on our mental map, not because we wanted a war, but because they controlled the only paved landing, and they knew we were out here. So we stopped doing easy. We landed only in dense brush, we humped lighter loads, and we left no boot prints pointing back to the waterline. Some people want a clean Hollywood ending where you win the war and the world resets. That's not how this works. This is just a floating room on a freezing lake, built from scrap, held in place by friction and physics, and kept alive by boring, repetitive habits. If you hear a stove damper squeak out on the water or spot a square shadow sitting too far from shore, don't wave and don't try to swim out to it. Keep moving, stay on your own survival plan, and let ours stay separate. My name is Keegan Wardell, and this is where we're riding out the long dark. If you enjoyed the story, please hit like, subscribe, and comment down below where you're listening from. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.